All right, welcome to episode 4, the Investigative Truth, Cold Case Missing. My name is Pat Obashan. I'm a retired police officer and detective from the city of Leominster in Massachusetts, and also a private investigator. So, as you can see, I've kept my promise with these videos. I'm not going to be behind a desk. I'm not going to be scripted, wearing a shirt and tie. And today, a little misty, but I figure we'll get out and talk a little bit about the months before Taj's disappearance and that day. So, again, I very appreciative to all the investigators who have put their hands on this case through the years. It is not easy to take one of these cases and work on them for a long time and still have them resolved, still have them cold. It is something that can take a toll, something that you have to manage, and that is just the reality of it. But credit to all of the people who have taken the time to look into Taj's case and the so many missing children and adult cases that we have in our country. At some point in these videos, I will talk about really the sexual exploitation and the sex trafficking that happened, back in the 70s and 80s in Massachusetts. There is some great podcasts out there specifically targeting those time frames, and I think it's important for people to know that this stuff does exist, it did exist, still exists, and there's always something better that we can do about it. So, Taj Narbonne lived in Leominster, Massachusetts. He lived at 15 Maple Street with his mother, Annette, and his stepfather, Clarence Dean. It's everyone knows that the relationship between Taj and his stepfather Clarence was not good. He did not like him. He had expressed that to family, to his mother, to his grandparents, especially Eunice and Louis Narbonne, and friends, many friends, several friends at least, at Fallbrook School, elementary school in Leominster. He shared his dislike of him. Taj, as I said in the previous episode, Taj was surrounded really by love. He had many people that loved him. His mother certainly did. That was, one of the issues at home, is how much his mother loved him. He had the love of his grandparents. He had the love of really family and lots of friends. That's probably really what makes this case the most difficult, is that, he had so much love, but when it came to home, not so much. And I know there's a lot of criticism. There's been a lot of criticism towards, different aspects of this case. But this is a commonality in society and children in their home, right? We all went through COVID. Doesn't matter how you think of it, what you think of it, but COVID put a lot of kids into their home for school purposes full time. And there are numerous articles, there were numerous concerns at the time that, kids were going to be home without anything to eat. And their meal of the day came from school. They were going to be in places where they possibly were not safe, or where there was domestic abuse. So, it really is nothing new. And, Taj's home life was, difficult for him. He didn't like being there, but he loved his mom. And that is really undisputed, his dislike and how he was treated at home by his stepfather. That is undisputed through witness accounts, statements, even, recently, talking to people who described those conditions. So when you talk about a case being active, it's finding people that you've never spoken to before and having conversations with them. So Annette, Clarence, Taj, they were members of Kingdom Hall, Jehovah's Witnesses in Leominster. They were very active in the church, as were their friends. And there's one thing, and again, something that I want to talk about a little bit. There's one thing that, back in that time, right, 1980, 1981, if you had an issue at home, if you had issues with your children, if you had issues with your spouse, if there were issues of abuse, if you were a member of a church, it doesn't matter what church, you brought your problems to the church. And a great example of that is, I would say, both the Jehovah's Witnesses who would seek assistance, seek, answers from the elders. And it was, of course, different then than it is now. I've talked to people who are still members. And, but any problems within the home, you sought, right, the advice of your elders. And again, it doesn't matter if it was domestic abuse or child abuse or just problems, simple problems in your home. Not different than the Catholic Church, and we certainly looked at domestic abuse and those types of abuse differently than we do today. That's a fact. I'll give you a great example. I did not grow up in a house where there was abuse. It was not domestic abuse. I was raised with a father who, pretty much said, you don't put your hands on a woman. His thought process was due to, right, what he experienced in his life. I appreciate that now because I don't do that. But when I got on the job at the beginning of 1988, I started going to domestic abuse cases. And, back in even 1988, very rarely did we have domestic calls. We never got calls for, fights between spouses, boyfriend, girlfriend, stuff like that, brother, sister, brothers, whatever. And I remember going to the first several of my domestics to investigate them and seeing someone, and it was usually primarily a female, that was just beat to a pulp. And as a police officer, you're trained, right, to help people. You're trained to do something, trained to have control and all that stuff. And I remember feeling extremely helpless for the victims of domestic violence, because we really did not address it as a society. That's what it comes down to. But make a long story short, in the late 70s, early 80s, even before that, we never really addressed domestic violence, child abuse. It was all swept under the rug. Your family can deal with it. Go and see, an elder, go and see a priest, go and see a minister, whatever. So, that was their life. That was Taj's life. And his home experience was so trying for him that Annette, his mom, had made a decision that it would be best for him to live with family friends who were also part of the church. So they knew Taj. They were, again, by all accounts, an incredible family, very supportive of their church members, and that was the Olsons. And it was about in November of 1980 they took Taj in, and they became his unofficial foster family. So Taj was there. He was going to Fallbrook School. Everything kind of normalized for him, with the exception of he really did not have a lot of contact with his mother, because Annette was still dealing with, a bad relationship with Clarence back home. And she wasn't able to talk to Taj as much as she would have liked. That's her own words. So I think it was December of 1980. Annette took Taj, and they stayed with friends out in Townsend for a little bit. And eventually, in January of 1981, she returned Taj back to the Olsons, and she returned back home to Maple Street. February of 1981, Taj was actually accepted into the foster program, and the Olsons became his official foster family. There was some hope that the stability of that, would make things better for Annette and Taj and their communications and whatnot, where he had a stable place to live. She knew that he would be well taken care of. And that was what her hopes were. But he did become part of the foster program with them. And then, March came along, and as Annette says, she was hoping that she could get her son back. And Clarence, her husband, Taj's stepfather, supported that idea. Actually said, let's bring him home and make things better. So on March 30th, it was a Monday night, at about 7 o'clock, Peter Olson brought Taj back to 15 Maple Street. Taj went into the house right away. Clarence wasn't home. And Annette stayed outside and talked to Peter for a while, and she went back in. While Annette was outside talking to Peter, Taj had gone inside and called his grandmother, Eunice, in Fitchburg, and asked her to come and get him. He told her that he didn't feel safe there. He told her that he felt that he was going to be harmed by Clarence, and to come and get him. And Eunice, by her own admission, and probably something I know that she lived her rest of her life with, told him that everything was going to be okay. Everything was going to work out, and she was not going to come and pick him up. There have been stories that Taj had been staying at his grandparents'. Been stories that Eunice dropped him off. There's been a whole bunch of stories, but Mr. Olson dropped him off. Eunice was home in Fitchburg, and Taj called her for a ride. So Annette comes in, she sits down, talks to Taj for an hour and a half, just really reassuring him that everything was going to be okay. Said that Clarence wanted to make things better. He did not have any reason to be scared. And, you know, it was her hopes that everything would be better at the home. And Taj went to bed. Annette was pretty much eight and a half months over, almost pretty much 9 months pregnant at the time. She waited up for Clarence to get home. He was at work. He arrived home, it was sometime after 10 o'clock. They sat down at the kitchen table and had a conversation about the day, about Taj being home, and how they would, you know, be working on things. They both went to bed at the same time, around 11:30 or so. Annette says that at 1 o'clock in the morning, she woke up thereabouts. Clarence was not in bed, so she got up to look for him to see where he was. She went around the house, looked around, didn't see anything. She was in the kitchen when Clarence came in from the outside front porch area in his bathrobe. That startled her to the point where she knocked some things over that were in the kitchen, and she was concerned that Taj would be scared from those noises and maybe fear that something was happening to his mother. So she asked Clarence to go in and reassure him that everything was okay and that everything was going to be okay, which Clarence did. He exited, he went back in a second time, came back out again. I'm not going to go into the conversations that took place during that time with anyone. And everyone went to bed. Early the next morning, or that morning, Clarence woke up to go to work. He was picked up by a known Leominster resident who recalls pulling up, recalls Clarence coming out. There was nothing out of the ordinary. This gentleman did not know Taj, but he did not feel that anything was out of the ordinary. He had very few conversations with Clarence as they'd go back and forth to tractor trailer school out toward Boston. But he picked him up. It was around 5 o'clock in the morning. When Annette awoke that morning to get Taj ready for school, she found him gone. She couldn't find him. He wasn't in the apartment. And she began looking throughout the apartment, looking outside, down toward the bus stop. She made a phone call to a friend. She called her mother. And then she called Clarence at this school. She eventually spoke with him, told him that she could not find Taj, told him that he was nowhere. He was not at the bus stop. He had not arrived at school, and no one had seen him. Clarence told her that he was on his way back home, back to 15 Maple Street, and to not report it to the police. What he didn't know was Annette had already called the Leominster Police Department to report Taj missing. That was the morning of March 31st, 1981. It was a Tuesday morning. When Clarence arrived home, the two of them went to Fallbrook School to check in with the administrators there to see if Taj was at school. He was not. Clarence had gone off on his own that morning looking for Taj while Annette was at the school. The first police report was not filed until 5 o'clock that afternoon. That was by Officer Dominic Tata. And, you know, that is really a talking point, right? How could a police department wait all day until someone, you know, took a report of a missing child? Well, that is how missing children were dealt with then. Fact. You know, now, right? Someone called in their 9-year-old missing child, you'd have immediate police response. Given the age and the situation, you would have a search. You'd probably have police officers going to homes of friends or in the neighborhood, right, to check. But back in the 80s, someone would disappear, and it wasn't dealt with immediately. I don't want to say it wasn't a priority, because obviously missing children were still priorities back then. But in this case, and as in many cases, hours and hours went by before that first initial report took place. Now again, you know, people will listen to this video and they'll be like, how could this happen? How could that happen? That is how it was. That is how it was. Things have changed. Things have changed for the better. As I said earlier, I used to go to domestics with no ability to arrest anybody. Things have changed, right? Now it's a mandated arrest when you see the evidence of domestic abuse. So, you know, looking back, you know, during the day and the subsequent days, really, things were done as they were normally done, whether we like it now or not. And that's what we have to work on. You know, that would also be probably a big red flag for, you know, a case in today's world where something happens and police, detectives, or whatever don't show up for several days later, right? Any defense attorney would love to have the opportunity to discuss evidence contamination and lack of searching and all of that stuff. So, and then the other part, and again, I will get more into how cases were, was that it was about 5 days after Taj's disappearance that the first newspaper article was printed. 5 days later. You know, and how we've changed with social media and being able to put things out there rather quick. I haven't shared anything today that hasn't been shared. Like I said, there's things that I can't share. But that is the story of the night Taj returned and the morning he was reported missing. I hope you'll join me for episode 5. We'll continue talking about the Taj case, talk about some things we learned that were in reports, some people that we were able to speak with that we had not spoken with before, and provided us some new information. Again, I'll go into what I can, but I'll share more about Taj's disappearance in episode 5. Thank you for joining me. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share if you want. Thank you.